Welcome, everyone. Good morning. Can everybody hear me in the back? Yep. Welcome. This is the session on U.S. foreign policy and 2018 elections. Thanks, everybody, for coming. My name is Andrew Albertson. I'm the Executive Director of Foreign Policy for America, which is a nonpartisan, membership-driven advocacy organization founded after the 2016 election to strengthen support for principled American engagement in the world. And I just want to start by saying how excited I am to be here. Just being in this incredible conference, seeing how much is going on, the incredible number of people who are here. I think all of us feel the sense that this is a difficult year. It's a difficult because we're concerned about what we're seeing in our country. And sometimes all of us, or at least just speaking for myself, I feel buffeted by the news, by the latest tweet when I wake up and I see it. And I think this is the answer. Or for me, this feels like the antidote. It's people coming together with the conviction that not only can I push back, I can do my part, I can take action, but there are thousands of people who share my values, who are committed to the same goals, who are working together determined to make sure that we can look back on this year as a historic turning point. So I find just being with all of you and being here inspiring, and I'm so appreciative that to have this opportunity. Now, I've been asked to offer a few framing remarks just as we get started with this discussion to set the stage, and I want to do that, but let's just say that at the outset that there's two stories for this year. There's a story that I think should worry us, and we need to face up to squarely. There's also a story that should give us a lot of hope. So the first backdrop to the elections, I think, is what President Trump has done and is doing that worries us all. So first, a military-first foreign policy, toying with the idea of attacking North Korea, extending our troop presence in Syria, scaling up support for the Saudi-led military conflict in Yemen, a massive increase in our defense budget, and juxtaposed with that a State Department where 8 out of the top 10 positions are vacant, where workforce reductions in the junior ranks guarantee that we won't have the qualified senior foreign service officers in the future when we need them down the road, and budget proposals that would cut non-military engagement in the world by a shocking third. The second thing, I think is a president making foreign policy decisions that appear to be self-serving or corrupt or at least inexplicable for reasons we have a hard time understanding. And third, I think President Trump has tarnished American credibility and reputation by walking away not only from traditional American values but from commitments that we've made to allies and adversaries alike. He walked away from the Paris Climate Agreement, from TPP, from U.S. responsibilities to refugees. And perhaps most consequentially, President Trump is now threatening to walk away from the Iran deal on May 12th. So that's one story. That's one important backdrop to the congressional races that we're watching. The other story, though, is the fact that we're living through a period of incredible national civic renewal, where millions of people are getting engaged and taking actions that they never have before in their lives. And it's incredibly exciting. Just to look at this one way, raise your hands if you've participated in a protest or a march or some other kind of political event this year. All right, fantastic. Well done. Raise your hand if you've contacted your member of Congress, either sent a piece of mail or made a phone call. Okay, this is a great audience. All right. Washington Post did a study, and nationally, 20% of Americans said that this year they'd attended a protest, rally, or speech. An unbelievable uptick in that kind of political action. The 4 largest protests in our country's history took place in the last 15 months. As far as contacting elected officials, Washington Post, again, did a study and said 40% of Americans have reached out to an elected official on some issue. It's an incredible number. At one point, the Senate was receiving 1.5 million calls in single days at the height of the health care debate. One Senate office reported that mail correspondence went up last year by 900%. Now, I have to pause and just say, and I'm talking statistics on this, the pollster Celinda Lake did an incredible 28,000 person study of who is calling members of Congress. And the statistic is that 86% of the people who called the members of Congress on the health care debate were women. So when we're talking about the story of civic renewal in this country, we do have to look at the fact that a lot of that is an incredible surge of women being active. The last question I wanted to ask, how many in this room decided for themselves that they wanted to run for elected office? We're excited to have Andy here on the panel. There are a few in the audience. But that's another part of the story, is the incredible uptick in candidates running. We're seeing at one point, and I'm not sure what the numbers are exactly right now, but at one point it was a quadrupling of the number of candidates that typically run in a given year for Congress. So all that adds up to the fact that we're living through an incredible moment. And I think we should all have a lot of hope and optimism about what's possible. And that's in part because of great candidates like Andy. So in addition to promoting our policy agenda at Foreign Policy for America, we also endorse and support candidates for Congress. And so just as a data point, we've now had conversations with almost 100 candidates who have a foreign policy or national security background. That's just an unbelievable number that are running like that, and want to be champions for progressive internationalist foreign policy. Of those candidates, we've only endorsed 8. And one of the first ones is the first panelist I want to introduce, Andy Kim. So Andy is a Rhodes Scholar. He served in Afghanistan with the State Department as an advisor to General Allen and General David Petraeus. Later, he served in the National Security Council as Iraq director, where he played a leading role in the effort to defeat ISIS. Last year, Andy decided to jump in the arena and run for Congress. So, Andy, if you could start us off, tell us your story. Why did you decide to take this plunge and run for Congress?
Sure. Can everyone hear me?
No. I don't think you're on.
Is that any better? There we go. Well, thank you so much for having me here. This is a real honor and a real privilege to be able to speak with all of you and be part of this broader community. When I was thinking about joining up on this panel, the question about foreign policy as well as for the 2018 elections, I get asked that question. Why am I running? Why foreign policy was my career? And I think the two are very much the same. So I'll be brief here. For me, when I talk to to the voters in the Jersey 3rd Congressional District and talk about my career, talk about why I'm doing this, I tell them that for me, foreign policy was the story of my life. I'm somebody who is the son of immigrants. My father was born and was raised in an orphanage in South Korea. He was a survivor of polio. He's somebody that was homeless during his childhood. And the United States gave him an opportunity, took a chance on him, gave him a chance to study here in the United States. He was able to become a PhD and a medical researcher in genetics, dedicated his life to try and cure cancer, trying to cure Alzheimer's. My mother also grew up right in the end of the Korean War, when the United States came in and changed the course of my family's life forever. And she was able to come to the United States as well, become a nurse, work in the hospital systems in New Jersey. My family is rooted in foreign policy, every aspect of what we do. And for me, I took that a step further. I dedicated my career to foreign policy and serving this country. I was, Andrew mentioned some of the things that I've done, and I had the privilege of working alongside of him in Afghanistan, alongside our armed service men and women and a lot of brave diplomats and intelligence officers and others. And I saw firsthand what goes into defending this country, what goes into securing our border, securing the American people. And right now, for me, a lot of that same passion for service, is what brought me to do what I'm doing right now. I feel compelled to stand up and fight for my country, fight for this area of New Jersey that gave my family every opportunity. You know, this place where I'm raising my 2 baby boys. And that's what this is really about, is that when I understand that, for me, my story is a foreign policy story. My family's story is foreign policy. And I dare to say that probably all of us can see ourselves in this. And I think that's what's so important. Because when I talk about foreign policy on the trail, when I talk about why I'm doing what I'm doing, these aren't just stories that we see in the news. These aren't just issues that we're debating in a newsroom or in the chamber of Congress. You know, these are human lives. These are decisions that are affecting us, our families, people across this world. And the more that I can make sure to anchor myself in that kind of humanity and understand and recognize what's being done and the impact that it takes on real people, I think the more it connects with voters, the more we understand the importance of this election, the important role that foreign policy and national security would play in this upcoming election. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Andy. The second panelist I want to introduce is Mika Oyang. So Mika is the Vice President for Third Way's National Security Program, where she works tirelessly to craft national security strategy and messaging that is both tough and smart. Before Third Way, Mika had a long career on Capitol Hill, including serving as professional staff member on the House Armed Services Committee, the subcommittee staff director on House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, defense policy advisor to Senator Kennedy, and finally chief of staff to Representative Anna Eshoo. And you may recognize Mika from all the time she spends on MSNBC and cable. Mika, it's so great to have you here. In your job, it'd be great if you could share a little bit more about kind of the work you're doing at Third Way, and especially with candidates. And I think you have a special vantage point on all the incredible candidates who are stepping up and running this year.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. So at Third Way, I run the National Security Program, and our National Security Program focuses on the politics of national security, which is a little bit different than thinking through what are the policy implications. What we see often for candidates and for elected officials, their policy choices are constrained by the politics of their particular districts. And so to understand how they might need to go forward on any particular foreign policy issue, you need to have some sense of how the public feels about this. So we've been doing public opinion work to understand how the two parties react and how their bases react to national security for quite some time. And so I get called to brief candidates like Andy, who I had the pleasure of briefing earlier this year, on sort of what are the dynamics in the politics of national security. And what we've seen over time, going back to at least the Vietnam War, is that people view the two parties very differently on national security. And in particular, they view Democrats they're less likely to trust Democrats than Republicans on national security, sort of as a base matter, irrespective of what the particular foreign policy decisions are. And that waxes and wanes over time, but we've seen recently 2 times when the Democrats were equal to or more trusted on national security than the Republicans. One was during the height of the Iraq War, the disaster that was the Iraq War, and as public opinion turned dramatically against that in the 2006 timeframe, and Democrats retook the House in that, surprising and somewhat landslide election. And we saw that the Democrats draw even to Republicans again in the 2012 cycle. The last midterm election in 2014, what we saw was a 23-point gap between the Democrats and the Republicans, where the Democrats were behind. And that in that 23-point gap, we saw a massive wave for the Republicans. They took the House. They took back. They defeated a lot of incumbent Democratic senators who were not expected to lose that cycle. And national security became a very important issue that cycle and came up out of nowhere. When most candidates had filed their petitions to run, national security was not on the agenda. But by the summer of 2014, when ISIS bulldozed the border between Iraq and Syria and Russia went in and took Crimea from Ukraine, national security became a tremendous issue for that election cycle. We also saw a lot of media coverage of Ebola coming across the southern border. Democrats' response to that
was not particularly good, and a lot of Democrats didn't know what to do with that, and we saw a lot of candidates lose. What we see this midterm cycle, unlike those in this 2018 cycle, is that we have seen a tremendous recruiting of candidates who have strong national security backgrounds, like Andy, people who have dedicated themselves to this series of issues. Seth Moulton has done a tremendous job of recruiting veterans. We've seen a lot of even civilians who have expertise at State Department and Pentagon running for Congress. These are not typical candidates that we've seen before. Often what you see running for Congress are people who are really well established in their local community, but have very little expertise in national security. And so what we see this time is people really stepping up who have a history of service to the nation in a very particular field, saying, I want to serve my country again in a different way. And so I think, expect that if national security rises to the fore in this cycle, the way that it has in the past, that we will have a very different response from our candidates because they have a lot of experience in these issues. But what we see also in the 2016 cycle was there was a real backlash against experience and expertise that President Trump ran as the most inexperienced national security candidate that we'd ever seen against the most experienced national security candidate we'd ever seen. And she beat him on every single public opinion poll on who would be the better commander-in-chief. And yet she still lost. Because what we saw is people were very frustrated with inside Washington and the sense that the inside the Beltway experts were not connected to what the needs of the people are. So this is the real risk for all of these candidates who are running the cycle with real national security backgrounds, is how do they navigate this path, this anti-expertise wave that we saw in the last cycle with their backgrounds and their tremendous experience in these issues. And I think that's the real challenge, is making sure they're still reaching people to speak to their needs and fears on these issues as we go forward.
That's great. Thank you, Mika. And the third panelist I want to introduce is Will Fisher. And actually, I think that cues you up really nicely, actually. So Will is the Director of Government Relations for VoteVets, the largest progressive veterans organization in America. Prior to his work at VoteVets, Will spent nearly a decade working at the National AFL-CIO on a variety of political, legislative, and organizing campaigns around the country. He has a really intimate sense of, I think, how veterans are responding to this moment and getting engaged. And I should say Will served in Iraq with the U.S. Marines. So, Will, great to have you here.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everybody. So thrilled to be here with each and every single one of you. I think it's interesting when we talk about, foreign policy in 2018, as the panel is today. There is this idea of domestic issues could certainly be sort of a driving force. But one of the things that we try to lift up is, to the old, harking back to Pericles a bit, right? With foreign policy, you may not take an interest in politics, but eventually it's going to take an interest in you. And I certainly believe that with the arrival of people like John Bolton into the White House, and with the possibility of the ascension of Mike Pompeo into to being the next Secretary of State, we are at a very, very dramatic moment in which foreign policy will continue, but in a very, very upfront way affect not only every single person in this room, but every single person who is drawing breath anywhere in this world. So at VoteVets, what we do is, as Andrew mentioned, we're the largest progressive veterans organization in the country. We have over 500,000 members in all 50 states. And on the domestic side, we try to work to lift up the fact that, every issue is a veterans issue, because veterans are part of society just like anyone else. Now, what we also do is work to lift up the voices of veterans from all eras, from different conflicts, to talk about how that experience of their time in service impacts their outlook on foreign policy and how that can help shape those of decision makers. And one area specific to 2018, I would say, where we do a great deal of work is in the recruitment of progressive veterans to run for higher office. And right now, we have more than 30 veterans who have been endorsed and who are running for federal office. We have people running for statewide office for gubernatorial races as well, and certainly hundreds of veterans in down ballot elections. But these, we don't just endorse somebody just because they're a veteran, right? If that were the case, Roy Moore would have been endorsed by us, and he wasn't, right? But so we work with these folks to identify, progressive champions, people who are progressive on foreign policy outlook, people who are progressive in terms of domestic policy issues, who can come to this town and help drive good progressive policy. And as we've seen, there have never been, roughly, fewer veterans than there are in Congress right now. And I think that we're seeing that reflected in basically Congress, just doing away with its war powers oversight and giving the president, not just this one either, the one before that and the one before that, through, these never-ending authorizations of military force that have now, since Donald Trump became president, I think we're up to 8 countries in which Americans have been killed in combat action. And if John Bolton and Mike Pompeo and the Donald Trump chorus for war continues to have their way, that number of countries and that number of individuals will continue to grow. So that's what I'm excited to hear to talk with y'all about today, on how we're doing that and how we talk about these issues, whether it's Syria, whether it's AUMF, whether it's Korea, the JCPOA, or others. But every single one of the issues that we're talking about affect every single one of us. And I think when we're talking about things like the Iran deal, when we're thinking about, Donald Trump taking to Twitter and capriciously talking about our nuclear arsenal, what that's doing is turning where you sit right now into a battlefield. We are all conscripts into those wars, and we have a person making that happen through being logged onto Twitter and being dictated by the hosts of Fox and Friends on what our foreign policy should be. So, Andrew, back over to you.
Thank you. So, Andy, I want you to help us understand what it's like on the trail and sort of the conversations you're having. But the other thing I wanted to raise, you mentioned to me the other day that for you in your district, foreign policy, national security, it's a local issue. And I thought it would be great if you could kind of share a little bit more about what you mean by that. And I'm also wondering, do you think that's specific to your district, or do you think that is true for a lot of candidates in a lot of districts around the country? So.
Happy to talk about that. So that's absolutely right. I mean, when I told Andrew was, for me, in my district, in New Jersey, 3rd Congressional District, foreign policy and national security is a local issue. We're the home of Joint Base McGuire-Dix Lakehurst. We have tens of thousands of armed service men and women that show up to work every day. My neighbors go to work in fatigues. And I think that, it's important for us to recognize that, because when we see the types of conflicts in the Middle East or elsewhere in the world, we recognize that that could very much impact our own communities. We've seen it happen over the years, and that's something that we talk about on a regular basis. For me, on the campaign trail, we do talk about national security and foreign policy a lot. I think people ask me, does it come up a lot? Well, it comes up a lot because I also think it's important to talk about. And I find that when we talk about these issues of the Middle East or Iran or North Korea or others, that it's clearly something that people are very concerned about. I think the issue is that maybe a lot of voters don't necessarily know how to ask the right questions, or they feel maybe a little intimidated digging into this. But when we start digging into it, especially on issues recently on North Korea, those are very much issues that I feel a lot of passion and concern about, a lot of worry. And so I don't want to shy away from that, because, these are issues that obviously I've dedicated a large part of my career to. But as I mentioned in my earlier remarks, what's key and important in talking about this is not talking about that as if I'm just talking on a news show, but talk about how that's impacting our own communities. Talking about how, as I was saying earlier, the humanity behind these issues and relating them to each and every one of us. And I think that's the connection that candidates should be trying to draw when they're talking about these types of issues across this country. I don't think that national security is a local issue just because we have the military base, just because we have, tens of thousands of veterans in our district as well. There are veterans in every single district in this entire country. There are people that are concerned about these issues everywhere. And I think it'd be a good thing for candidates all over this country to be talking about these issues and making it known where we're at, especially because I agree that with this new foreign policy national security cabinet that we're seeing being formed. I worked in the Situation Room before, and imagining Donald Trump at the front and seeing John Bolton to his left and possibly Secretary of State Pompeo to his right, those are going to be that's going to bring about a new national conversation about foreign policy and national security inevitably. So it makes sense for us to be ahead of that and make sure that we're getting our message out there and talking about it on our own terms.
I think it's really important we talk about John Bolton and Mike Pompeo in this moment. Quiz question: what is the common thread between Barbara Comstock, Mike Kaufman, and Brian Mast? All three were endorsed by John Bolton, who runs a PAC or ran a PAC, is supporting candidates, is trying to find a nice batch of John Bolton acolytes in Congress who will be there to vote if there's a congressional authorization for the use of force. Will John Bolton be a factor in these elections, Mika, or anybody?
I think so. It's very clear we are at a very important transitional moment in the Trump administration. When he first came in, everyone was so worried about his bombastic language on the campaign trail and the way that he would just pop off and say that he could shoot people on the street in New York and he was going to bomb these people all over the place. But when he came in during the transition, he picked some people to be in his national security cabinet who seemed like grown-ups. Right? And we called them the axis of adults. We talked about Mattis. We talked about Tillerson. To a lesser extent, Nikki Haley. We were talking about people who are much more traditional Republicans, a little bit more restrained in use of force, a little bit more thoughtful, and potentially people who had learned the lessons of the Iraq War. What we're seeing now in the replacement of H.R. McMaster with John Bolton, with the replacement of Tillerson with Pompeo, with the rise of Gina Haspel at the CIA, we are seeing Trump picking people who he's much more comfortable with, people who are yes men and enablers, people who are more likely to encourage his instincts to revenge, to escalation. And so this is a very important moment that we're wrestling with right now in the Senate as we go through these hearings. And as Senator Menendez pointed out in his closing at the Pompeo nomination hearing, people are going to say a lot of things that sound very reasonable to try and get through Senate confirmation, but as he pointed out, it's which one of these people are we really voting to confirm? Are we voting to confirm the people who are saying, these, I will be responsible and I will speak truth to power, or the people who, when they weren't seeking this office, were urging regime change in Iran, were arguing for regime change in North Korea, and not thinking about the consequences of those actions on the American people, on the people that we would send to go do those things. And I think we are at this moment of transition where if these people are installed, it does not take them very long to make the kinds of disastrous foreign policy decisions that we saw in the 2002-2003 timeframe.
So can I just add real quick to her point? One thing I would say is, in terms of John Bolton and mattering, I think it cannot be undersold enough how much he will matter. John Bolton to a lot of people is just like finding an old calendar, right, from an era in your life that you didn't like. And people connect to him. And Donald Trump spent so much time when he was running for president going into working class communities and talk about, if I am elected president of the United States, I am not going to get us into dumb wars. I'm not going to go send young men and women in all over the world to go fight these never-ending, regime change type conflicts. And yet, what has he done? Now brought in the drum major of the war in Iraq, John Bolton, into his office. And what that has shown is that there is not a bit of daylight between Donald Trump and Dick Cheney. And I think that the American people and the electorate will absolutely take note of that.
So there's one other thing about which raises that raises about John Bolton, which is really important. To a large extent, we have been spared some of the worst foreign policy instincts of the president because of his incompetence, right? He says things on Twitter, and then Mattis is like, that's not a real order. I'm not going to do that. John Bolton is a guy who knows how to manipulate the intelligence to take the nation to war. He did that. His intelligence briefer when he was at the State Department came as a whistleblower to Congress when I was there during the Iraq War to say, this is a guy who is twisting the intelligence to suit his own needs. And he was so toxic that he was unable to win confirmation in the Bush administration because of his abusive treatment of his subordinates and because of the ways in which he manipulates intelligence. And now he is the guy who is closest and a few steps away from the president every day talking to him about issues for war.
So I think it's really important that we square up to this question of, are we careening towards a new military conflict, right? 15 years ago, there was a vote. I guess I also want to put this in perspective. We're celebrating the 10-year anniversary of J Street. And there's been a lot of work that's been done that Third Way has done since 2005, 6? BOFETS has done since 2006. So there's a lot of work that's been done over the last 12 years, a lot of efforts made. 15 years ago, there was a vote to authorize the use of military force in Iraq. Now, there's rumblings of a very different kind of AUMF vote that could come rather soon in Congress. What has changed in your perspectives over that last 10-year stretch since J Street has started? And what has changed in terms of how you, in terms of political incentives that members of Congress are thinking about as they vote on issues of war and peace this year?
For me, I mean, this is a very personal issue as well. I mean, the Iraq War decision in 2003 is what spurred me on to dedicating my career to foreign policy and working on conflict issues, doing everything we can to try to bring our armed servicemen and women home as soon as possible. I think for my generation and that grew up in that through those wars, I think there is a lot of initial immediate concern about seeing that kind of same ramp up. And when we see some of those same figures back in these seats of power, like John Bolton, it certainly is something that perks up our ears and gets our attention. I think what we are mindful of as a broader public, seeing this both from the outside as well as having been inside the Situation Room on these decisions, is the incredibly important role that information is going to play. We have a much more informed public in terms of the ability to push that information out about these foreign conflicts, about these crises that come up. I know that when we were dealing with the rise of ISIS and doing everything we can to push back and fight back against that threat, this issue about information was front and center. What information can we trust? What information, does the American people need to have? And I think what I want to see go forward this year, leading up to the elections, and then from that point onwards, is for that to be discussed and that information to be available to the American people and to have a broad conversation. We're going to be dealing with a lot of major issues going forward, potentially even a discussion and a debate about conflict. And it's very important to bring the American people into that discussion and not rush things through. Make sure that that information is available, that it's credible. And what worries me is when I see how this administration and this Congress has been moving forward on health care, on taxes, and all these other issues that they try to jam through in the middle of the night. That American dialogue, that discussion, that information that you need to understand what our country is doing is missing. So when I think about what's about to happen, whether it's discussions about the Iran deal or a new AUMF or North Korea dialogues, that's what's we got to make sure is happening, that there is transparency to these actions and that people can be held accountable for the decisions that are made.
I think when we talk about authorizations for use of military force and when people say, is this strike legal or illegal, right? Should we take the nation to war? It sounds, right, and this is one of the dangers of the expertise, it sounds like, oh, we're letting the rules get in the way of what the the real foreign policy question is. And I think the important thing to remember is that debate about whether or not we have a authorization for use of military force is a proxy for something that is embedded in our Constitution, which is that it gives Congress the power to declare war, because you wanted the people's branch to be held accountable for the decisions to send Americans into harm's way and to take the nation into a place that was going to risk a lot in human lives and in financial cost. And so what we have seen is recently, or actually over time, going back to the Clinton administration, a slow erosion of Congress's power and ability to stand up to a president and say, no, the people have to have a say in whether or not we're going to war. And part of the reason that it's so important is because for you as voters, that vote is a proxy for you to say, my representative made a decision that I believe in or didn't believe in, and I can hold them accountable for this. During the Obama administration, when they were thinking about seeking authorization for the use of force to strike the Assad regime for its use of chemical weapons, Jack Kingston said, a Republican from Georgia, said, look, nobody really wants to have this debate because we'd rather just complain about it, but we don't want to be on the record on how we actually feel about this. And that's what Congress has been avoiding. Congress has not stepped up to its role to be a check on an executive in the fundamental questions of war and peace in a very long time. And it is very clear that this particular Congress, doesn't care because they didn't even bother talking about sending up an authorization for the use of military force, unlike the Obama administration, who at first sent one and then managed to avoid the conflict completely. This is so that they don't actually have to answer for this to their voters in this question of, should we in fact be involved in this conflict in Syria? And there was an attempt in the Senate to actually hold members accountable to the question of whether or not we should be involved in the civil war in Yemen. But unless voters are saying to their members of Congress, we care and we want to know where you are on these things, Congress will continue to avoid responsibility.
One thing, just quickly, I would say, we talk about AUMF's authorization of military force, and we mentioned the one for the war in Iraq. I just want to point out real quick, just to give some context. This year, young women and men will be deployed to Afghanistan who are in the U.S. military, who were literally wearing diapers when their being sent to Afghanistan was being debated last. Right? To just think about that for a moment and how Congress is surrendering, just abdicating their war powers. And it's a travesty, and I do believe that it is one of those things that the more and more veterans, progressive veterans who are elected to Congress, the more and more authorization and retaking back of some of those roles and responsibilities as it relates to war powers will be.
So I just want to think, again, back to candidates and these incredible challenges we're seeing. As I said, one of the stories this year I think we just have to look at is not only are there incredible numbers of women who have called members of Congress, there's an incredible number of female candidates. Amy McGrath, Elaine Luria, Mikey Sherrill, all Naval Academy graduates in the same couple years apart. Is that right? Will, I'm curious, have you seen something different from some of the female veterans who are running this year?
I think just more of them, right? I mean, I think a couple of years ago you saw like Tammy Duckworth, right? And it was sort of became a recognized person and candidate across the country, and now she's serving as a U.S. senator, and we're really happy about that. And then you're seeing more and more, but I think that also that just goes to the fact that there are more and more women serving in the military these days. I think that this goes to the fact that we have been at war now for 17 years coming up, and as such, yeah, there are more women veterans, and as more women veterans are going to be taking charge and wanting to run for higher office. And we're seeing that all the way down the ballot, right? You're seeing that in local races and, of course, at the federal level. And you just pointed out, I think there are either 9 or 11 female veterans right now who've been endorsed by Vote Vets, some of whom you just mentioned.
I started my career working for Pat Schroeder. And I want to say we are actually at a seminal moment of women in the military right now. Pat started her career fighting for the right for women to serve in combat. And she lifted the combat exclusion for women in the Navy in 1991. Many of these women who are running today were women who were first able to serve in combat billets as a result of those actions. right? In combat aviation, on Navy ships. We just saw the lifting of the ground combat exclusion as late as the Obama administration. What that means is something very fundamental for women veterans. Until that, women had been relegated to roles that were clerical, medical, legal, desk jobs. This now is a moment for the first time where we have real women warriors. We saw women serving in ground combat adjacent positions, going out on patrols in the Iraq War and Afghanistan. For the first time, we have a generation of women who have proved their mettle in battle. And this is actually a fundamental question for the leadership of any nation, going all the way back to Plato. Who deserves to be a guardian? And for so long, women were excluded from that definition. They were not people who were, in the eyes of the nation, willing to put their lives on the line on behalf of the nation to defend it. And now, for the first time, we are seeing that. And so now, for the first time, we are seeing a generation of combat-tested women who are running for office. Tammy Duckworth was one of the first, sacrificed tremendously for the nation. And so we are seeing something really, really profound. Now, one can argue in Israel, they've actually solved this problem quite a long time ago with the integration of women into the IDF. But in America, we are at a very profound moment about what it means for women as candidates and as veterans.
Andy, help us think in terms of, I think we've talked a lot about how important it is to check the Trump administration, for Congress to step up and do its job in a variety of ways. So let's imagine forward. Now it's January 2019, okay? You've won your race. Your race is right on that mark where, you know, if you win, it's likely that Democrats take control of the House. Let's imagine Democrats take control of the Senate. What does that change? What can you do in Congress? What will you be thinking about in your first few months?
I try not to think that far ahead just so I don't jinx myself. But, you know, for me, what I promise the people of my district is not just better policies, but better politics. And what I promise them is, you know, I am going to move forward. I'm going to, you know, make sure that I'm the most accountable, accessible, and transparent member of Congress that there is. You know, that means, you know, I pledge to have a public town hall in the district every single month. It means that I pledge to have daily reports coming out from my office about what I'm doing, who I'm meeting with, what issues are coming up, where I stand, that we can do this together. So when I think about what would happen if I were to win this election and what we can do going forward, first and foremost, I want to be the representative that the people in my district deserve. The kind of representative that's going to be true to that and understand that I would then have 750,000 bosses that I have to account to, and that's why I need to respond to them. So first and foremost, it's about, you know, making sure that my district, that the constituents there have the kind of voice that they've been wanting to have in Congress. Second, it's about making sure that we can be the types of leaders that this country needs at this moment. That we are not afraid to speak out on the issues that we need to, that we are ones that are going to take firm stances, and that we're going to be independent thinkers through this all. And we can work together to be able to figure out the best way forward. You know, I'm proud of the fact that I was a career public servant. You know, I'm proud of the fact that I've served under, you know, Republicans and Democrats. And when I was out in Afghanistan working alongside armed service men and women, no one there asked us if we were Democrats or Republicans. You know, we were just focused on the mission at hand. And I think the mission at hand right now, in my mind, is clear. But the problem is that so much of what we need to get done to help the American people and help get our country on a better path is being overshadowed by this hyperpartisanship that's been so corrosive and decaying our democracy. And I think that that's why you see a lot of candidates that come from a service background. We feel compelled that the oath that I swore to protect this country and serve this country didn't end the day that I left my work in government, that would continue on. It's not just something that ends at the end of the workday. You know, the way my parents taught me was that service isn't just a job, it's a way of life. So I want to make sure that we use every lever that we have at our disposal in Congress to make sure that the American people have the information that they need, that we can have a real discussion in Congress and in this town, in Washington, D.C., about what these steps are going forward. And I think what's going to be important is that by controlling the House, if we're able to take it, and controlling the chairmanships of the committees and controlling a lot of those different levers, we can make sure that these types of fiascos, like passing a tax bill in the middle of the night without even the legislators having time to read it, let alone the American people, that those are not the types of actions that are done, especially when it comes to national security issues, where, in my personal opinion, those are issues on national security where we need to really keep the partisan politics out of it and really think about this in terms of the lives that are on the line, especially our armed service men and women and other Americans that are in harm's way.
Terrific. I'm going to ask the same question to Will and Mika. What's at stake? But just before I do that, just so you know, what we'll do next is transition to asking your questions. And so take a moment to think about what questions you want to ask these three. But Will, Mika, what's at stake?
Limiting it to this foreign policy discussion, I want to be brief and say that it really is going back and seizing back some control over war powers by the Congress. Mika was talking earlier about people like John Bolton enabling the worst parts of Donald Trump. And as, sort of the news of the day continues to close in around Donald Trump, and the headlines are being dominated by his personal lawyer's office being, raided or, so on and so forth. Donald Trump instinctively, he's a reality TV show huckster. And what's he want to do now? Flip the script. And John Bolton could say, you want these headlines to change, boss? Let's go bomb somebody. And they will. And Donald Trump is the kind of person who would absolutely go along with that. And that's why it is so extremely important for Congress to not abdicate their roles in overseeing war powers. And I believe that is absolutely what is at stake, not just, electorally, but as I mentioned earlier, for the lives of every single person on this planet.
I agree with my two other panelists. I think what's really important here is that the basic structure of the Constitution is checks and balances, right? Congress was designed to check the executive. The courts were there to oversee both of them. What we see right now is the Trump administration trying to pack the courts from all of the nominations that they held back from the Obama administration. We saw that on the Supreme Court this year. We see a compliant Congress not asking this administration to give them real answers on what the strategy is for Syria or in North Korea, so they can just go behind closed doors and then sort of wing it as they go forward, right? We get these back and forth policies on trade and on our relationships with our allies and on NATO. At this point, the real question is, are we going to continue to allow a system that is so fundamentally unbalanced? Or are we, as the American people, going to restore some checks to the system?
With that, I do want to open it up to your questions. I've taken my fair share. There's a microphone, so just line up behind here. What we'll ask everybody is to just keep your questions brief so we can get to as many as possible. And I think make sure to phrase your question in the form of a question. So please, go ahead.
I just want a little more clarity on the AUMF. Does the president have to come to Congress, or can Congress take the initiative? And if the current Congress does not take an initiative, can the next Congress do something?
And could you just introduce yourself?
My name is Edith Goldman. I live in Maryland.
Thank you.
Thank you. So just to run through the technicalities of the AUMF and war powers, if a conflict is otherwise legal under international law, for example, self-defense, the president can go 60 days on his own authority without coming to Congress. And past presidents have argued that particular kinds of conflicts, for example, the Obama administration argued this about Libya, they were going to go 60 days and then stop before coming back to Congress. But what we've seen is an expansion of conflicts going forward. Congress has two ways that they can check the president. One is to deny an authorization for use of military force. Some presidents would consider going forward because they don't really care about the rules, potentially this one. And then the other thing that Congress can do is cut off funds. And this is when there have been serious threats to cut off funds the presidents have actually withdrawn once in Vietnam and once during the Iraq War.
Please.
Hi, my name is Abe Jelinek. I'm a student at UC Berkeley. And my question is, with John Bolton in office, if Pompeo is not confirmed, who do you think would be Trump's second choice? And what's the best case scenario if Pompeo isn't confirmed for foreign policy under the Trump administration going forward?
Well, I'm not sure I have the best pulse on the latest palace intrigue in terms of who would be after that. I mean, I think, seeing who else is in the foreign policy world certainly is, something that he would consider. He seems to, So, I'm not sure exactly what other names would be out there. I don't know if any of you guys do, but.
No, and I wouldn't dare try to go, spelunking into the mindset of Donald Trump and who he would want if Mike Pompeo is not confirmed.
The short answer, though, is if Pompeo is not confirmed, that the current acting secretary, John Sullivan, who's the number 2 in the building, would continue on as the Secretary of State. And he's a reasonable person and a careerist. But potentially other nominees they've talked about include Nikki Haley. And beyond that, we don't know. Potentially Tom Cotton, who's never met a war that he didn't like.
Yeah.
Jason Berkovich from San Diego, California. On the AUMF, I was wondering if you guys can touch on, has any polling been done? Do you guys know what the reaction would be? Because this seems like, with all the partisanship, it seems like one of the things where you have Ron Paul is agreeing with Barbara Lee, who's agreeing with Tulsi Gabbard. It's like a left and right, but then the middle tends to be really quiet on this. So Congress seems to want to stay in Congress, most of them at least, and that's how they're voting recently. So what do the polls say as to, do people actually want an AUMF, or do they think the president could, as the commander-in-chief, just go out and keep doing what he's doing?
So I think it's a great question, and I'm so happy that you mentioned the bipartisanship, because it is an area where it is not uncommon, for example, on the House side, to have Barbara Lee and Walter Jones doing an event together about war powers, or on Yemen recently you had Senator Sanders and Mike Lee doing an event together around Yemen and authorization for force there. And this is an area where you see some bipartisanship. And I will tell you, not directly related to polling, but I have been pleasantly surprised at, for the lack of a better term, the name ID of AUMF. And I think because of the seemingly never-ending wars, people are aware of this AUMF. And look, everybody's not everybody, but look, people are a lot more hawkish when they don't have to vote on it. And I think that people know that how one voted for the war in Iraq, right? That's going to be in everybody's obituary who voted on it. And as such, people tend to be a little less, I don't know if we want to vote, but people want to see Congress getting skin in the game and taking these votes and debating where we are sending young women and men. And it's certainly something we work to lift up every single day.
I think the real challenge for Andy, if he gets elected, is going to be, what does the AUMF actually authorize? Which conflict? How broad? How long? And I think this is the reason that Congress has avoided having this debate thus far, because to deal with ISIS, there's this question of if they cross borders, do we cross them too? Do we stay until they're defeated? What does defeat look like? Should we be involved in fight against all terrorism, Iranian-backed terrorism, terrorism that's only threatening the United States? I don't think that people have a good sense and are not being forced to narrow down what is America's national security interest here, so that we can be very precise about exactly what it is that we're trying to fight.
But that's exactly why I think it's so important that we have candidates and members of Congress with strong national security and foreign policy background. We want people in Congress that can actually talk about these issues with real substance and real intelligence, and be able to convey that to not only their constituents, but be able to have these types of forceful debates. Where we can have real discussions about that, and that they can go toe-to-toe with, experts and diplomats and members of the executive branch to be able to hold them accountable. So that's why I'm really excited about doing this. And like I said, as somebody who has a joint military base in my district, if elected, I want to make sure that I have that say, and that we are defining that, and we're giving as much transparency to that process.
Hi, my name is Elliot Davis, and I'm a sophomore studying at Duke University. My question's to you, Mr. Kim. One of the questions earlier discussed in the panel was, come November of 2018, if you have Democrats taking back the House and the Senate, what would be different? And you focus more on the political change, which is really important. But I'd like to hear a little bit more about the policy change of what bills would make it to the president's desk and what policies would actually be enacted before 2020. Thank you.
Well, I think some of that's going to depend on how the Senate does as well, and seeing how this plays out across the board. I mean, what I would like to see, for instance, and I won't diverge too far from the topic of this discussion, but I think that when I go around my district and talk to voters about what's on their mind, making sure that we're talking about a positive agenda as well. What I hear a lot about is infrastructure. Jobs, things that we can do working together. We all recognize that our country needs to have a new foundation for our 21st century economy, something that's going to propel us forward and have a real vision for what that next phase of our economy and our country is. So, I would love for us to be able to find ways to have agreement on infrastructure, ways where we can address key issues like the opioid crisis that, is killing hundreds of people, every day in this country. I think the way I see it is, when we talk about national security, so much of what we're talking about here is foreign policy, right? But I think, I venture to guess, a lot of us would agree, for me, the opioid crisis is a national security crisis. For me, climate change is a national security crisis. For me, so much of what we're faced with goes back to that core issue of why it is I got into the work I'm doing and what national security means to us. And I hope that kind of framework allows us to find better avenues for bipartisanship, being mindful of the fact that if elected, I know that President Trump's still going to be in the Oval Office, and that's going to affect the kind of legislation that gets passed and eventually turned into law. So, I hope some of those issues are ones that we're going to be able to make progress on, but that's going to really be dependent on what shakes out in both the House and the Senate and what the atmosphere is. And I hope that the American people send a clear message that they want to have a Washington that is focused on them and not that hyper-partisanship that we've been seeing so far.
Please.
Hi, I'm Jonah Klein Barton. I'm a student at Washington University, and I guess I'm wondering, you mentioned that Vote Vets had endorsed a lot of down-ballot and local candidates as well. So if they win, how do you see people with progressive values and being veterans affecting the foreign policy discourse at the local level?
Well, to the point that was made earlier that foreign policy is a very local issue, and if you're a state senator or a mayor or a city council person and you have a military base close by, that's obviously going to be very effective, very affected by our international relations and foreign policy. I think another thing that people, when we talk about the Korean Peninsula, obviously there are very important conversations on what that a war there would look like in terms of lives lost. But I think that and there's another angle of this conversation of what does that look like in terms of treasure. The number of South Korean businesses that have factories and plants all over the United States of America. And all of a sudden, if the Korean Peninsula is engulfed in flames, what happens to these thousands of people in the United States who work at Samsung? And all of a sudden, and that's not happening. So very much on a local level, those city council races, mayoral, state senate, state house, that are definitely involved with foreign policy. And look, at the same time, if you're running for state senate now, there's a chance that you're going to want to run for the United States Congress down the road. So the more and more we have veterans getting engaged, progressive veterans getting engaged, the more and more we'll build that out for the long term. Because you have to remember, like I said earlier, the number of veterans who are in Congress right now has basically never been lower. And as Vietnam veterans begin to retire, it will be Iraq and Afghanistan veterans and those of that similar era who will be coming in to those places and eventually, hopefully, getting back to the point where we have more and more veterans in office debating these issues of war and peace.
I want to make sure we get to all the questions here, so maybe two of you can share your questions this round.
Sure. Hi, I'm Rabbi Pam Wax from the Bronx. I want to follow up on that veteran question. Are we also seeing vets who are running as Republicans, number one? Number two, what is the pulse of vets in general, whether they are voting more Democrat these days? And for Mr. Kim to address what makes you a Democrat as opposed to a Republican, having worked for both, under both. Thank you.
I would, to the first part of your question, yeah.
Take one more, yeah. Oh, sorry.
No worries. Hi, my name is Susan Navi. I work for the Friends Committee on National Legislation, which is a Quaker peace and social justice lobby. My question goes back to something you touched on earlier. The difference between the mixed campaign trail signals, where sometimes it was very bellicose and then sometimes it was very much, we want to get out. Whereas now it's really been solidified that it's much more the bellicose, aggressive type of foreign policy. And you said that you think that that message has been heard loud and clear by voters, but do you really think that that message has been heard by Trump's support base? Because a lot of people did vote for him thinking that we would be getting out of conflicts, but this seems to be the opposite of getting involved in more and more. Thank you.
Mika, could you answer the last question first?
Yeah. So on this question of Trump's bellicosity, I feel like one of the things that we saw over the weekend with these Syria strikes was actually a really negative reaction from his base, where Laura Ingraham and Alex Jones of InfoWars were very much against these strikes and worried about getting pulled into another war. So it'll be interesting to see how Trump reacts to that, while at the same time he's getting pushed into this bellicosity by Bolton. At base, though, he's a bully. He wants to threaten and yell, but he doesn't actually want to get into the fight. So if a country is willing to say, you want to go? We'll go, right? Then he's going to back down. And you saw that reaction from China on the tariffs, and you see that reaction from the Russians on Syria. So I think that when he's faced with real consequences of actually having the U.S. get its nose bloodied in the process, like many bullies, he just doesn't want to do it, and he's going to back down.
Then to the first part of the question.
So on the pulse of veterans in general, are there Republicans running, and are there more veterans voting Democrat?
So you ask, are there veterans who are running as Republicans as well? Yes. In terms of where veterans are politically, we are seeing a huge number, big-time enthusiasm among veterans in the progressive space, especially in the wake of the election of Donald Trump. A lot of enthusiasm and a lot of mobilization around, yes, these foreign policy issues, but also a lot around domestic policy issues. Veterans leading the charge against the idea of having military parades or arming school teachers, so on and so forth. And this foreign policy area is definitely another one. I think the issue of the day where that is being very seen are huge numbers of veterans speaking out the idea of Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. One, because this is a war and peace issue, but at the same time that Mike Pompeo, and being the idea of a Secretary of State Pompeo, is counter to the values that veterans hold dear. This is someone who is a bigot. This is someone who supports torture. This is someone who is anti-reproductive health, who doesn't believe in climate change, so on and so forth. And we are hearing from huge numbers of veterans all across the country speaking out against Mike Pompeo and the idea of him being the next Secretary of State and the face of our nation to the rest of the world.
Yeah. For me, I often think through this, the final experience that I had at the White House. Actually, the last time I was there is at the end of my service there in the Obama administration. And I had this incredible opportunity of being able to take my parents, who I told you the story about what they went through in their life, and walk them into the Oval Office and introduce them to President Obama, the President of the United States, while I was holding my then 4-month-old baby boy in my hand. And 3 generations of my family in the Oval Office meeting the president. I think about that a lot because I think of that as that's America. That's the America that I love so much. And when I think about everything that it took to get our family to that moment, about immigration, about the fact that I did my entire education, K through 12 in the public school systems in New Jersey. When I think about my father being a polio survivor and both my parents being in the medical field and teaching me that without your health, you don't have the opportunities for the American dream. You don't have those types of efforts that can get you to that next stage and that mobility. So for me, those are the values that make me a Democrat and make me proud to be a Democrat and proud to be running in this cycle, doing what we can to be able to push forward. This isn't about this vote or that vote. For me, it's really at the core of just what do I believe are the values that drive me, that have given my family the opportunities that have helped my district, and I truly believe that those are the values that we're trying to push forward right now.
So I do want to see if we can get all the rest of the questions. So just if you could keep it really short, rapid fire, we'll take these 4 questions, and then we'll try to answer them and wrap up. Please, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Noah Redlick. I'm a freshman student studying at Harvard University. And during the campaign trail, President Trump, as was said earlier, challenged the foreign policy establishment, said he wanted to get out of NATO or pull out of NATO. He wanted to withdraw troops from the Middle East. But as president, I would argue he's done the exact opposite. He's sent more troops to Afghanistan, he's kept us involved in the war in Yemen, and he's now sent airstrikes into Syria. So is your message on the campaign trail that Trump has been too hawkish and he's been too much relying on these hawkish voices in the establishment like Bolton, or he's been too isolationist and too outside the mainstream? Thank you.
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Hi, I'm Yosef El-Shwek. I'm a senior at Sharon High School, and I was interested in Mr. Kim talked about the culture in the military that regardless of politics, the military is able to establish one goal and really get it done. And I think at a time when veterans in America are dying at home more than they're dying overseas, how can we get more veteran voices in to get bipartisanship in Congress and in our politics?
Thank you.
My question is really for Mickey. My name is Fareed Kress. I had a small trust. Do you believe that campaign finance reform that was championed by McCain and Feingold for years is dead? And secondly, have you discovered in your surveys that you do that the right-wing elements of both parties are the ones that have precedence, and moderate Republicans have no place in the Republican Party, moderate Democrats have no place in the Democratic Party?
Thank you. And then our last question.
Hi, I'm Lloyd Truffleman from Westchester, New York. Listening to this panel has been great because there's a certain amount of optimism that I'm feeling, maybe others of us are feeling, in terms of this blue wave that seems to be rising. But yet, with regards to foreign policy, my question is, look, Trump's approval rating since the day he came in has been staying there at 40% of those people supporting him, and nothing that's been going on really has changed it much. Most Americans are not engaged in foreign policy on any level. If you ask them to name an ambassador or the Secretary of State, they wouldn't know. So I'm just wondering, are we being a little bit too inside the Beltway, a little bit too optimistic about chances for the midterm elections, or should we be maybe a little bit more concerned, especially in light of the basic destruction of the news media and common ground around that? So I guess I'm asking, should we be more worried, and if so, what really can we do to try and push things in a progressive direction?
So thank you all for these great questions. Mika, do you think you could speak to this question? Trump started as isolationist, now he's looking like a hawk. What's the right way for candidates to
chicken hawk
to these issues? Okay, there you go. And if you could also, I don't know if anybody would like to take the campaign finance reform question.
So I'll just really quickly on that. Sort of Trump, is he a hawk or is he an isolationist? And then I'll talk about the moderates and campaign finance reform. I think it's really, I don't know that he knows what he is on any given day, right? He wakes up, he's one thing, by the end of the day, he's something else. The tweets are all over the place, which makes him really hard to run against as one or the other. But the bigger problem is he's just incredibly erratic. And that is really dangerous for our allies and adversaries alike, not to know where the United States stands. Right? You need to know where we stand as a nation. The American people need to know where we stand as a nation. And he's extreme in both directions, and it's just really damaging to our credibility around the world and here at home that he's just all over the place. But I think that that's reflective of the question about the rise of the extremes on either end and the lack of a voice for the moderates. What we've seen on social media, what we've seen in the Trump era, is there is extreme polarization in the two political parties, where people are becoming less interested. They're so angry, they're less interested in finding that common ground. And the country faces some really big problems that need solutions. We can't just yell at each other, and it can't be a zero-sum game on solutions. And so then the question becomes, where are those pragmatic voices who are willing to sit down with people who disagree with them and say, all right, where is our common ground? Where can we find some compromise? Where can we find a place where we can move forward on these problems? And the challenge when the electorate is so extreme that they only want people who are going to be 100% in agreement with them and not recognize that this is a country that the basic structure is about compromise and moving forward. It's about finding common solutions. It's a big and complicated country. And so if we don't find a place for those moderates who can say, hey, I am willing to work with you on trying to find a solution, and maybe it's not a 100% solution, but maybe it's 75%. Let's book the progress we can get today and move on. If we're not willing as Americans to elect those kinds of people, then we're really in trouble in terms of trying to find solutions.
Will, I think
If I
could just say, it seems like a lot of folks have made this point that if we elect more veterans, veterans who have served together in Iraq and Afghanistan towards a common mission, they're going to be able to find more middle ground. Is that your take? How do you view that?
I do think that, yes, there is a level of esprit de corps that exists between veterans, and I think that you see that on the Hill in some of the bipartisan groups and caucuses that some of the veterans are very much involved with. I do think, though, that it's important to always remember that, we don't want to go out and elect veterans for the sake of electing veterans, but elect veterans who celebrate ideals which we believe in. Like I said earlier, Roy Moore is a Vietnam veteran. I sure as hell won't go work to get him elected to the U.S. Senate, right? Mike Pompeo graduated top of his class at West Point. He's a veteran. I don't think he ought to be Secretary of State. But what I do think we should do is work to find veterans who, again, hold on to those ideals and share those ideals that we hold dear and work and do everything we can to get them elected to office. The first point you asked about Donald Trump, look, I think there's a real question in this country right now, and I don't mean to try to gild the lily and say that we were perfect before that, but right now, if you are a head of a foreign nation, the United States cannot trust what the President of the United States says to you. And I think that is a real thing that makes this time in which we're living right now so incredibly dangerous. And the last thing, to your point about veterans and the issues veterans are facing at home. One of the things I work to lift up every single day is the fact that there is not an issue being debated that does not affect veterans, because veterans are part of society like anyone else. You've mentioned, like economic opportunity. There is a veteran class in the United States. It's fundamentally part of the working class. I did not serve in Iraq with anyone named Trump or Koch, right? I served with people from the working class who have returned to the working class. So when you look at these domestic policy issues, they are all very much veterans issues. The Farm Bill is being debated right now. That includes funding for SNAP, right? 1.5 million veterans households turned to SNAP benefits last year. 23,000 active duty households. Fight for 15 is being debated. Well, 1 in 5 veterans in this country are in a minimum wage job. So the fight over a livable wage is very much a veterans issue. We can go on and on and on. And again, I cannot stress enough that there is not an issue being debated. And if you check out VoteVets, you can always figure out how we are communicating how those issues impact veterans and military families.
Terrific. And Andy, I wanted to say for you this question. Are we being too optimistic? Are folks taking for granted certain outcomes? How would you respond?
Well, I would say now is the time for this kind of optimism. We need that hope. We need that belief that things can be better. And for me, I had this experience when I worked in the Situation Room where, we were getting word of this tens of thousands of Yazidis fleeing up to the top of Sinjar Mountain with ISIS in hot pursuit. And I think about that a lot because, we went through that process of seeing a potential genocide of the Yazidi people. We were able to find people to work together and come up with a way in which, with 24 hours, we had airdrops, tens of thousands of pounds of food, water, shelter material dropped on a mountain on the other side of the world, deep in enemy territory. I saw what our country can do when we put our minds to it and when we focus on that mission. There's a reason why we have this global leadership and this global power. And I'm optimistic because I've seen a better government. I've seen a government that can inspire, a government that you deserve. And for me, what I see right now to answer some of those questions, what we see is just a lack of strategy, a lack of vision for what we need on the foreign policy side. And when, even though people in my district might not be able to name who are the cabinet members on foreign policy, what they can tell and see on a visceral basis every day is the sheer dysfunction in what's happening right now in Washington. And what I just finish off on that is that it comes down to this question. Do you feel like you're in good hands? Do you feel like if there's a major crisis that this government, that this Congress, that this administration is going to be able to do things in a way that you will feel in good hands, and that you will feel like they will approach that in the way that you want them to approach it? And I think that's the issue. So even if they don't know John Bolton or Pompeo or some of the other key figures, what I can tell you is they know what they see, and they don't want that dysfunction. And I think that's what a lot of this is going to be about. So I say stay optimistic. We have that hope because we can and deserve a better government.
And we do need to wrap. So just really quick.
I just want to say, to your point, because I think one of the things I'm picking up from what you're saying is one of the most difficult parts of the time in which we're living right now is finding oneself trapped sort of almost in a vortex of opposition, of constantly only talking about those things to which one is opposed. And I think it's very important, whether you're running for office or just an engaged citizen, to help make that in optimism stay alive, to keep that fire burning, is yes, to keep talking about those things to which we are opposed. There's no shortage of them. But also remembering to constantly be lifting up those things which we believe in as well. So that's just, I wanted to piggyback a little bit on that.
So I think it's a fantastic place to wrap up. I'll just leave where we started, which is I think there are two stories to this year. I think there's a story of a lot of the concerns we had, a lot of the concerns we raised. We all know how much is at stake. I also think we debated a little bit about whether this is going to be a national security election. Whatever happens, whatever issues are in the background, I think it already is. I think that one of the storylines that's going to happen in 2018 is we have seen an extraordinary number of candidates who have run in part because of their background in service, in national security and foreign policy, and that is connected with voters. And they have run in part because they care deeply about these issues. We're incredibly fortunate to be seeing this huge number of candidates that are running with that background and that passion and that commitment. And it gives me a lot of hope for what we're going to see next year if we can, to the optimism point, if we all do our part, and we do see a transformation of Congress. I don't think we've seen a number of candidates like this over the past several years. I think that there are reasons, and people have been building to this over a long time, and I think it's helpful to view that through the lens of J Street's 10-year anniversary, all the work that has been done, and I think that also keys up to the next conversation that's going to be happening in this room about how the policy shift has happened in Congress over the last 10 years, again, because of all the work that people have done year on year, cycle on cycle. So thank you all for this incredible discussion. Thank you for participating with great questions. Thank you to our panelists for this wonderful back and forth. And I will just invite everybody to hang around for that next conversation, including another of our endorsed candidates, Nancy Soderberg.